Lieutenant Sarah Chen sat in the back corner of the briefing room, her small frame almost invisible among the towering Marines and naval officers. While others argued loudly about deployment strategies and orbital positions, she remained silent, her dark eyes studying the holographic displays that showed enemy positions across 3 different star systems. Her hands rested quietly in her lap, but her mind was calculating trajectories, ammunition loads, and firing solutions with the precision of a quantum computer. The Krillian invasion had caught humanity off guard 6 months ago. Their massive dreadnoughts had appeared at the edge of human space without warning, their weapons technology far superior to anything Earth's military possessed. Entire colonies had been wiped out in hours, their populations either killed or enslaved. The aliens seemed unstoppable, their armor too thick for conventional weapons, their shields deflecting most human firepower like rain against a window. Sarah had grown up on the farming world of New Manitoba, where silence was golden and hard work spoke louder than words. Her father had taught her that actions mattered more than speeches, and her mother had shown her that quiet determination could move mountains. When the recruitment officers had come looking for artillery specialists, Sarah had signed up without saying a single word to them. She had simply walked to the table, filled out the forms, and handed them back. Her training scores had been extraordinary. While other cadets struggled with the complex mathematics of long-range ballistics, Sarah seemed to understand the physics instinctively. She could calculate wind resistance, planetary rotation, and gravitational pull in her head faster than most computers. Her instructors had never seen anything like it, but Sarah had never bragged or even mentioned her abilities. She let her test results speak for themselves. Now sitting in this briefing room aboard the UES Defiance, Sarah watched as Admiral Morrison outlined their desperate mission. The Krillians had established a major staging ground on the planet Kepler 442b, using it as a launch point for attacks deeper into human territory. The planet's surface was covered with their massive artillery installations, weapons that could reach into orbit and destroy any ship that came too close. "We need to take out those surface installations," Admiral Morrison was saying, his weathered face grim with determination. "But every approach we've tried has failed. Their weapons have longer range than ours, and their targeting systems are incredibly accurate. We've lost 3 cruisers and a battleship trying to get close enough for a bombardment." Major Rodriguez, the Marine commander, slammed his fist on the table. "We could try a ground assault, sir. Land forces on the far side of the planet and work our way to the installations." "That would take months," Captain Williams objected. "We don't have months. Intelligence reports show they're preparing for a major offensive. If we don't stop them here, they'll push all the way to Earth." The argument continued, voices rising as frustration mounted. Sarah listened to every word, but her attention was focused on the tactical display. She could see the problem immediately. The Krillian installations were positioned in a perfect defensive pattern, covering all orbital approach routes. But there was something the others had missed, something that might be possible with the right calculations and perfect timing. She raised her hand. The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at the small woman in the corner, surprised that she had spoken up. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she forced herself to stand and walk to the holographic display. "Permission to speak, sir?" she asked quietly. Admiral Morrison nodded, clearly curious about what the young artillery officer might contribute. Sarah pointed to a specific area on the planet's surface, her finger trembling slightly from nerves but her voice steady. "The Krillian installations are designed to defend against orbital bombardment and direct assault, but they have a blind spot. This canyon system runs for 200 kilometers, and it's positioned at exactly the right angle. If we could get artillery units into position here, we could fire over the canyon walls using an indirect trajectory. The shells would come down almost vertically, hitting the installations from an angle they're not designed to defend against." Major Rodriguez studied the display, his expression skeptical. "That's a hell of a long shot, Lieutenant. We're talking about extreme-range artillery fire over difficult terrain. The mathematics alone would be incredibly complex." "I can do the calculations," Sarah said simply. Captain Williams laughed, but not unkindly. "With respect, Lieutenant, we're talking about precision targeting at ranges that push the absolute limits of our equipment. One small error in calculations and we'd be firing blindly into empty space." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I've run preliminary calculations. The plan is feasible, but it would require perfect coordination and absolute precision. The margin for error is essentially zero. Admiral Morrison studied the young officer carefully. He had read her file before the mission, noting her exceptional scores and the glowing recommendations from her instructors. But this was different. This was suggesting a military operation based on her ability to calculate artillery trajectories that would challenge even advanced computers. "How confident are you in your abilities, Lieutenant?" he asked. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, thinking of her quiet childhood on New Manitoba, of her father's lessons about letting actions speak louder than words. "I've never missed a target, sir. Not once." The room was silent as the senior officers absorbed this statement. It wasn't boastful or arrogant. It was simply a fact stated with quiet confidence. Admiral Morrison made his decision. "Very well, Lieutenant Chen, you'll have your chance. We'll modify the mission plan to include your artillery strategy. But understand this. If your calculations are wrong, a lot of good people are going to die." Sarah nodded, her expression serious but determined. "I understand, sir. I won't let you down." As the briefing broke up and officers began filing out to prepare for the mission, Sarah remained at the holographic display, her mind already working through the complex equations that would determine the fate of the operation. She had never raised her hand to speak in a meeting before, but when it came to artillery, she spoke with the voice of thunder itself. The dropships descended through Kepler 442b's atmosphere like falling stars, their hulls glowing red from atmospheric friction. Sarah sat strapped into her seat, surrounded by the massive components of her mobile artillery platform. The M47 Thunderstrike system was humanity's most advanced field artillery weapon, capable of firing smart projectiles across hundreds of kilometers with devastating accuracy. But it had never been tested under the conditions they were about to face. Beside her sat Sergeant Marcus Webb, her spotter and communications specialist. Webb was a 20-year veteran who had seen action on a dozen worlds, and he had initially been skeptical about being assigned to work with such a young officer. But Sarah's reputation had preceded her, and the stories about her uncanny ability with artillery had spread throughout the ranks. "First time in real combat, Lieutenant?" Webb asked as the dropship shuddered through a patch of turbulence. Sarah shook her head. "I was at the Battle of Proxima Station," she replied quietly. "But this is different. The range is much greater and the variables are more complex." Webb studied her calm expression with growing respect. The Battle of Proxima Station had been a desperate last stand against Krillian forces, where human defenders had held out for 3 days against overwhelming odds. If she had been there and survived, she was tougher than she looked. The dropship's pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Approaching LZ Alpha, 60 seconds to touchdown. All units prepare for immediate deployment." Sarah closed her eyes and ran through the calculations one more time. Wind speed, atmospheric density, planetary rotation, gravitational pull, target distance, projectile mass, muzzle velocity. Dozens of variables that all had to be perfectly balanced to achieve success. Most artillery officers relied heavily on computer assistance for such complex calculations, but Sarah preferred to work through the mathematics herself, using computers only to verify her results. The dropship touched down with a jarring impact, and immediately the rear ramp began lowering. Sarah could see the alien landscape of Kepler 442b through the opening. Rocky, desolate terrain with strange purple vegetation clinging to the canyon walls. In the distance, barely visible through the atmospheric haze, she could make out the towering structures of the Krillian installations. "Move, move, move," shouted Major Rodriguez as Marines poured out of the other dropships, quickly establishing a defensive perimeter around the landing zone. Sarah's artillery crew worked with practiced efficiency, unloading the components of the Thunderstrike system and beginning assembly. The massive gun barrel was 40 feet long and required a specialized crane system to position correctly. The targeting computer was the size of a small building, packed with processors and sensors that could track multiple targets simultaneously. But while her crew worked on the mechanical assembly, Sarah was focused on something else entirely. She had pulled out a small handheld device that looked almost primitive compared to the high-tech equipment around her. It was a simple rangefinder, modified with additional sensors for measuring wind speed and atmospheric conditions. "Lieutenant, the computer system is online and ready for target acquisition," reported Corporal Martinez, her chief technician. "Thank you, Corporal." but I won't be needing the automated targeting system for the initial shots," Sarah replied, still studying her readings. Webb looked surprised. "Ma'am, regulations require computer-assisted targeting for extreme-range engagements." Sarah turned to face him, her expression serious but confident. "Sergeant, those regulations were written for normal combat situations. This isn't normal. The Krillian installations are protected by energy shields that can disrupt our targeting sensors. Computer-assisted targeting will be unreliable at best. We're going to have to do this the old-fashioned way." As if to prove her point, a massive energy blast lit up the sky above them. One of the human cruisers in orbit had attempted to fire on the Krillian positions, but their shot had been deflected harmlessly by the alien shield system. In response, the Krillian installations had fired back, their purple energy beams reaching up through the atmosphere like the fingers of an angry god. "Command, this is Artillery Unit Alpha," Sarah spoke into her communications headset. "We're in position and ready to commence firing. Requesting target priority." Admiral Morrison's voice came back immediately. "Artillery Alpha, your primary target is Installation 7. Coordinates being transmitted now. This is their main power generator. If you can take it out, it should weaken their shield network." Sarah studied the coordinates on her display, then looked through her rangefinder toward the target. Installation 7 was nearly 300 kilometers away, barely visible even with enhanced optics. The shot would have to arc high over the canyon walls, then come down at precisely the right angle to penetrate the installation's defenses. "Range 297.4 kilometers, she announced to her crew. "Wind speed, 15 kilometers per hour from the northwest. Atmospheric density, 87% of Earth normal. Planetary rotation compensation, 0.03 degrees left deflection." Her crew worked quickly to input the firing solution into the Thunderstrike system. The massive gun barrel began to elevate, turning toward the distant target with mechanical precision. "Ammunition loaded and ready," reported Corporal Martinez. "High explosive smart round with armor-piercing capability." Sarah made one final check of her calculations, running through the mathematics in her head with lightning speed. Every variable had to be perfect. There would be no second chance if the first shot missed. "Fire," she commanded. The Thunderstrike system erupted with a sound like the world ending. The massive projectile shot out of the barrel at hypersonic speed, disappearing into the alien sky with a crack of displaced air. For several seconds there was only silence as everyone waited to see the result. Then, in the distance, a brilliant flash of light appeared where Installation 7 had been. The explosion was visible even from their extreme range, a mushroom cloud of fire and debris rising into the atmosphere. "Direct hit," shouted Webb, unable to contain his excitement. "Perfect bullseye on the first shot." Over the communications network, they could hear the excited voices of the orbital fleet. "Installation 7 is down. Their shield network is fluctuating. Artillery Alpha, that was incredible shooting." But Sarah was already working on the next target, her rangefinder sweeping across the battlefield as she identified Installation 4, the secondary power generator. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, calculating new variables and adjusting for the changed atmospheric conditions caused by the first explosion. "Second target acquired," she announced calmly. "Range 312.7 kilometers, adjusting for thermal updraft from previous explosion." The second shot was even more challenging than the first, requiring compensation for the heat distortion caused by the destruction of Installation 7. But Sarah's calculations were flawless, and the second projectile found its mark with the same devastating accuracy. Within 30 minutes, Sarah had destroyed 4 major Krillian installations, each shot fired with computer-like precision, but calculated entirely by hand. Her crew watched in amazement as their quiet lieutenant demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to hit targets that should have been impossible to reach. "How does she do it?" whispered one of the Marines to Sergeant Webb. Webb just shook his head in wonder. "I've been in artillery for 20 years, son, and I've never seen anything like it. She doesn't just calculate trajectories, she thinks like a projectile. It's like she can see the path the shell will take before it's even fired." Sarah continued working, her concentration absolute, as she methodically eliminated the alien installations one by one. Each shot was a masterpiece of ballistic calculation, taking into account dozens of variables that would challenge even the most advanced computers. But for Sarah, it was as natural as breathing. She had found her voice at last, and it spoke with the thunder of artillery. News of Sarah's incredible artillery performance spread through the human fleet like wildfire. Within hours, every ship in the task force had heard about the quiet lieutenant, who could hit targets from impossible ranges with devastating accuracy. The orbital bombardment that had been planned for weeks was completed in a single afternoon by one woman, with a mobile artillery platform. But the Krillians were not finished. As Sarah's crew prepared to move to their next position, alien reinforcements began arriving from deeper in their territory. Massive troop transports descended from orbit, disgorging thousands of Krillian warriors onto the planet's surface. These weren't the static installations that Sarah had been targeting. These were mobile enemies, fast and deadly, equipped with personal shield generators that made them nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. Artillery Alpha. "This is Command." Admiral Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "We have a problem. Krillian ground forces are advancing on your position. Estimated time to contact 40 minutes. Can you relocate?" Sarah studied the tactical display on her portable computer. The Thunderstrike system was incredibly powerful, but it was also massive and slow to move. Breaking down the artillery platform, moving it to a new position, and setting it up again would take at least 2 hours. Far longer than they had. "Negative, Command," she replied calmly. "We can't move fast enough. We'll have to make our stand here." Sergeant Webb looked at her with concern. "Lieutenant, we're talking about thousands of enemy troops. This position wasn't designed for ground defense." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. But as she looked at the approaching enemy forces on her display, she saw something that others had missed. The Krillian advance was following the natural terrain features, using the canyon system for cover as they approached. They were moving in predictable patterns, following routes that would bring them through specific choke points. "Sergeant, what's the minimum range for the Thunderstrike system?" she asked. Webb consulted his technical manual. "Officially, it's 20 kilometers, ma'am. Below that range, the projectiles don't have enough flight time for the guidance systems to function properly." Sarah smiled grimly. "What about using unguided rounds?" "Unguided rounds?" Webb looked shocked. "Ma'am, with respect, unguided artillery at close range is incredibly dangerous. Without computer guidance, there's no way to ensure accuracy. You'd essentially be firing blind." "Not blind," Sarah corrected. "Manual calculation. I can compute the trajectories for unguided rounds just as accurately as guided ones. The mathematics are actually simpler." She was already working the numbers in her head. The approaching Krillian forces would funnel through 3 main canyon passages, each one presenting a perfect target for close-range artillery bombardment. The key was timing. She would have to wait until the maximum number of enemies were in the kill zone, then fire multiple rounds in rapid succession. "Command, this is Artillery Alpha." She spoke into her radio. "I'm going to attempt close-range bombardment of the advancing enemy forces. I'll need all friendly units to maintain a minimum distance of 5 kilometers from my position." There was a pause before Admiral Morrison responded. "Artillery Alpha, are you certain about this? Close-range artillery is extremely dangerous, especially with enemy forces so near." "I'm certain, sir," Sarah replied with quiet confidence. "I can stop them." She turned to her crew, who were watching her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Corporal Martinez, I need you to load unguided high-explosive rounds. We're going to fire at minimum elevation, maximum charge. Sergeant Webb, I need continuous range and bearing updates on the enemy advance." Her crew worked quickly to reconfigure the Thunderstrike system. The massive gun barrel was lowered to its minimum elevation, aimed toward the canyon passages where the Krillian forces were advancing. The automated targeting computer was switched off, leaving Sarah to calculate firing solutions entirely by hand. Through her rangefinder, she could see the first enemy scouts emerging from the canyon mouths. The Krillians were tall insectoid creatures with chitinous armor and multiple arms that could wield several weapons simultaneously. Their personal shields shimmered around them like heat mirages, deflecting the occasional small arms fire from human reconnaissance. "Units. First target group entering Kill Zone Alpha," reported Webb, range 8.7 kilometers and closing. Sarah watched the enemy advance with the patience of a predator. More and more Krillian warriors emerged from the canyons, forming up into assault formations as they prepared for their final attack on the human position. She waited until nearly 1,000 enemies were visible in the open ground between the canyon mouths and her artillery position. Fire mission. Target massed enemy infantry in the open. Range 8.2 kilometers. Bearing 047 degrees. Charge maximum. Time of flight, 14.3 seconds. The Thunderstrike system fired with its characteristic thunderclap, sending an unguided projectile screaming toward the enemy formation. Sarah was already calculating the next shot before the first round hit. The explosion was devastating. The high-explosive round detonated directly in the center of the Krillian formation, the blast wave and fragmentation cutting down dozens of enemies in a single instant. But more importantly, the explosion disrupted their shield generators, leaving the survivors vulnerable to conventional weapons. Second target, Canyon Mouth Bravo, Sarah announced, her voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. Range 9.1 kilometers, bearing 082 degrees. The second shot was equally accurate, sealing off the canyon mouth and trapping hundreds of Krillian reinforcements behind a wall of rubble. Sarah continued firing, each shot precisely calculated to maximum effect. She targeted choke points, blocked retreat routes, and created kill zones where the surviving Krillians would be exposed to devastating crossfire from human ground forces. "This is impossible," breathed Corporal Martinez as he watched Sarah work. "She's firing unguided rounds at close range and hitting targets smaller than a football field. The calculations alone should take hours." But Sarah wasn't using calculations in the traditional sense. She had developed an almost intuitive understanding of ballistics, able to visualize the trajectory of each projectile as clearly as if she were watching it fly. She could see the arc of the shell, predict exactly where it would land, and adjust for wind, elevation, and target movement without conscious thought. The Krillian advance faltered and then broke entirely, faced with devastating artillery fire that seemed to anticipate their every move. The alien warriors retreated back into the canyon system. Those few who had survived the bombardment found themselves cut off from their reinforcements. Easy targets for the human Marines who were now advancing to mop up the scattered resistance. "Artillery Alpha, this is Command." Admiral Morrison's voice was filled with amazement. "I'm looking at the battle damage assessment and I can barely believe it. You've destroyed or dispersed an entire Krillian assault force with approximately 20 artillery rounds. That's the most effective use of artillery I've ever seen." Sarah felt a flush of pride, but she kept her voice professional. "Thank you, sir. We're ready to continue the mission." Over the next several hours, word of Sarah's incredible performance spread beyond the immediate battle zone. Soldiers throughout the human task force began requesting artillery support from the Wizard, as they had started calling her. Every ground unit wanted Sarah Chen covering their advance, and every ship captain wanted her artillery protecting their landing zones. But with fame came new challenges. The Krillians had also taken notice of the devastating effectiveness of human artillery, and they were already adapting their tactics. Intelligence reports showed them developing new countermeasures, new ways to neutralize the threat that Sarah represented. The war was far from over, and Sarah would need to prove that her incredible abilities could evolve to meet whatever challenges the enemy might devise. She had demonstrated that she could command artillery with supernatural precision, but the real test was yet to come. As night fell over the alien landscape, Sarah stood beside her Thunderstrike system, studying the tactical displays that showed Krillian movements across the planet. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new challenges, and new opportunities to demonstrate that human determination and skill could overcome any obstacle. She had never raised her hand to speak in conversation, but when she spoke through artillery, her voice could be heard across entire star systems. 3 days after her devastating display against the Krillian ground forces, Sarah found herself facing a completely new type of enemy. The aliens had brought in something the human intelligence analysts had never seen before. Massive walking war machines that stood nearly 200 feet tall, equipped with energy shields powerful enough to deflect orbital bombardment, and weapon systems that could destroy entire city blocks with a single shot. The creatures were called Devastators by the human forces, and they moved across the battlefield like walking mountains of destruction. Their thick armor plating was designed to withstand the most powerful human weapons, and their energy shields created a protective bubble that extended nearly a kilometer in diameter. Conventional artillery bounced off them harmlessly, and even nuclear weapons seemed to have minimal effect. "We count 6 of them advancing on our main defensive line," reported Major Rodriguez during the emergency command briefing. "At their current rate of advance, they'll reach our positions within 4 hours. Our ground forces are already falling back. There's nothing we can do to stop them." Admiral Morrison studied the tactical display with growing desperation. The Devastators were spaced perfectly to provide mutual support, their overlapping shield systems creating an impenetrable barrier that protected not only themselves but also the thousands of conventional Krillian troops advancing behind them. "What about orbital bombardment?" suggested Captain Williams. "If we concentrate the fire from all our ships." "We tried that yesterday against a single Devastator," Morrison replied grimly. "We hit it with everything we had: plasma cannons, railguns, even fusion torpedoes. The shields absorbed everything we threw at it, and the creature kept advancing as if nothing had happened." Sarah sat in her usual place at the back of the briefing room, studying the enemy formations on her portable display. The Devastators were indeed formidable, but as she analyzed their movement patterns and shield configurations, she began to see potential weaknesses that others had missed. The shield systems were incredibly powerful, but they operated on a rotating frequency cycle to prevent overheating. For approximately 1.3 seconds every 30 seconds, each shield would flicker to a lower power state while the generators cycled. During that brief window, the Devastators would be vulnerable to attack, but only if the incoming fire arrived at exactly the right moment. More importantly, Sarah realized that the Devastators' massive size worked against them in certain situations. Their centers of gravity were high above the ground, making them potentially unstable if attacked in exactly the right way. A precisely placed artillery strike at the base of their support legs could potentially topple them. Shield or no shield? She raised her hand. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at the young artillery officer. Admiral Morrison nodded for her to speak. "Sir, I believe I can stop the Devastators," Sarah said quietly. Major Rodriguez looked skeptical. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, we've thrown everything we have at these things. Orbital bombardment, heavy missiles, even tactical nuclear weapons. Nothing works." Sarah stood and walked to the holographic display, pointing to specific details on the Devastator formations. The shield systems operate on a 30-second cycle. For 1.3 seconds during each cycle, they drop to approximately 40% power. If I can time my artillery strikes to arrive during those windows, the projectiles should penetrate. Captain Williams shook his head. Even if that's true, the timing would have to be absolutely perfect. We're talking about hitting a target the size of a building from extreme range, with the projectile arriving during a window that lasts barely over a second. The calculations would be impossibly complex. "I can do the calculations," Sarah replied simply. Admiral Morrison studied her carefully. He had seen what she could accomplish with artillery, but this was different. This was asking her to perform precision strikes that would challenge the laws of physics themselves. "What exactly are you proposing, Lieutenant?" Sarah turned back to the display, her finger tracing the path she had calculated. "The Devastators have high centers of gravity. Their stability depends on their massive support legs maintaining contact with the ground. If I can hit the base of those support structures during the shield vulnerability window, I can potentially topple them." She paused, running the mathematics through her head one more time. "I'll need to fire multiple rounds in sequence, timed to arrive at different targets during their respective shield cycles. The first Devastator will be the test shot. If I can bring it down, the others will likely alter their formation, giving me new targeting opportunities." Sergeant Webb, who had been listening from beside the door, stepped forward. "Lieutenant, the Thunderstrike system can fire a maximum of 1 round every 45 seconds. You're talking about engaging 6 targets that are spread across a 20-kilometer front. The timing requirements—" "I've run the calculations," Sarah interrupted gently. "It's possible, but I'll need to modify our ammunition loads. Instead of standard high-explosive rounds, I'll need armor-piercing rounds with delayed fuses. And I'll need the orbital fleet to provide target illumination with low-powered laser designators, not to damage the Devastators, but to help me track their exact positions." Admiral Morrison made his decision. "Do it. Lieutenant Chen, you have full authority to modify the artillery platform as needed. All fleet units will provide whatever support you require." 2 hours later, Sarah stood beside her Thunderstrike system, which had been reconfigured for the most challenging artillery mission in human history. The massive gun barrel had been fitted with a new targeting system that could track multiple moving targets simultaneously, and the ammunition storage had been loaded with specially modified armor-piercing rounds. Through her rangefinder, She could see the first Devastator approaching through the distant haze. It moved with surprising grace for something so massive, its 4 support legs carrying it across the rough terrain with mechanical precision. The energy shield around it shimmered like a soap bubble, deflecting the occasional human weapon fire that still reached it. First target acquired, Sarah announced to her crew. Range 43.7 kilometers. Target velocity 12 kilometers per hour. Shield cycle beginning in 15 seconds. She made final adjustments to her calculations, compensating for the target's movement, the atmospheric conditions, and the complex ballistic requirements needed to hit such a small target at extreme range. The margin for error was essentially 0. If her shot arrived even half a second too early or too late, it would be deflected harmlessly by the shields. Firing in 3, 2, 1. Fire! The Thunderstrike system roared, sending its armor-piercing projectile screaming across the battlefield. Sarah was already calculating the trajectory for her second shot before the first round reached its target. 47 seconds later, the first projectile arrived at exactly the moment the Devastator's shields flickered to their vulnerable state. The armor-piercing round punched through the weakened energy barrier and struck the creature's front left support leg at precisely the calculated impact point. The effect was spectacular. The massive support structure buckled under the impact, and the Devastator's enormous weight shifted beyond its ability to compensate. With a sound like a falling mountain, the 200-foot war machine toppled forward, crashing into the ground with an impact that registered on seismic sensors 50 kilometers away. "Target 1 is down," shouted Webb in amazement. Perfect hit. But Sarah was already focused on the second Devastator, which had begun altering its course in response to the destruction of its companion. The remaining 5 war machines were spreading out, making themselves harder to target while maintaining their advance toward the human defensive positions. Second target acquired, compensating for evasive maneuvers. Range 39.2 kilometers. She fired again and again, each shot timed to perfection. The second Devastator fell when her projectile severed its rear support cables. The third collapsed when a precisely placed round damaged its balance sensors. One by one, the massive war machines that had seemed invincible were brought down by perfectly calculated artillery strikes. Within 2 hours, all 6 Devastators lay motionless on the battlefield, their destruction visible even from orbit. The Krillian ground forces, deprived of their massive escorts, found themselves exposed to devastating human counterattacks. Artillery Alpha, "This is Admiral Morrison." The voice on the radio was filled with awe. "I'm looking at the battlefield assessment and I still can't believe what I'm seeing. You've single-handedly destroyed 6 enemy superweapons that our entire fleet couldn't scratch. How is that even possible?" Sarah looked out across the battlefield where the fallen Devastators lay like toppled giants. "Physics, sir. Everything follows the laws of physics, no matter how big or powerful it seems. You just have to understand the mathematics." That night, as the human forces consolidated their victory, Sarah's name was mentioned in communications across the entire task force. Soldiers who had never met her spoke of her with something approaching religious reverence. She had taken on enemies that seemed beyond human capability, and defeated them through pure skill and determination. But Sarah herself remained focused on the mission ahead. The Devastators had been just one weapon in the Krillian arsenal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new enemies, and new opportunities to prove that human ingenuity and precision could overcome any obstacle. She had shown that even the mightiest enemy could fall to perfectly placed artillery fire. Her voice, when she chose to use it, could topple giants. The message arrived during the quiet hours before dawn, when Sarah was performing routine maintenance on her Thunderstrike system. The communication was marked with the highest priority encryption, routed directly from Earth Command through 17 relay stations to reach her position on Kepler 442b. Sergeant Webb handed her the decoded message with a grim expression. "Ma'am, this came in on the priority channel. It's marked for your eyes only." Sarah read the message twice before the full meaning sank in. The Krillians had broken through the outer defense lines of the Sol system. Earth itself was under direct attack, and human forces were falling back to the planet's surface for a final desperate stand. But more devastating than the military situation was the personal news buried in the tactical report. New Manitoba, her home world, had been completely destroyed. The farming colony where she had grown up, where her parents still lived, was gone, vaporized by Krillian orbital bombardment 3 days ago. She sat in silence for a long time, staring at the words on the small screen. Her parents, her childhood friends, the quiet farming community that had shaped her into the person she was, all of it was simply gone, erased from existence as if it had never been. "Ma'am?" Webb's voice was gentle, concerned. "Is everything all right?" Sarah folded the communication device and slipped it into her pocket. When she looked up, her expression was calm, but Webb could see something different in her eyes, a coldness that hadn't been there before. "Sergeant, please ask Admiral Morrison to meet me at the command post. I have new targeting priorities to discuss." An hour later, Sarah stood before the senior staff in the makeshift command center. The holographic display showed the tactical situation across human space. Dozens of worlds under attack, fleet elements scattered and fighting desperate holding actions. Millions of civilians evacuating deeper into human territory. "Admiral, I request permission to modify our mission parameters," Sarah said without preamble. Morrison looked surprised. "Lieutenant, our current mission is proceeding exactly as planned. We've neutralized the Krillian installations on this world and secured the staging area. What modifications are you proposing?" Sarah gestured to the strategic display, her finger pointing to a cluster of Krillian fleet positions near the galactic core. "Intelligence reports indicate that the Krillian High Command is operating from a fortress world designated Target Omega. It's heavily defended by orbital platforms and shield generators, considered impregnable to conventional assault." "That's correct," Morrison replied slowly. "Target Omega is the center of their military hierarchy. Taking it out would cripple their entire war effort, but it's also suicide. The defenses around that world are unlike anything we've ever encountered." Sarah's expression remained completely calm. "I can destroy it." The room fell silent. Major Rodriguez was the first to speak. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, Target Omega is protected by defensive systems that make our previous targets look simple. We're talking about hundreds of orbital platforms, overlapping shield networks, and automated defense systems that can track and destroy incoming projectiles from impossible ranges." "I've studied the intelligence reports," Sarah replied. "The defensive systems are powerful, but they're designed to counter conventional attacks, fleet bombardments, missile strikes, fighter attacks. They're not designed to defend against extreme-range artillery fire from a planetary surface." Admiral Morrison pulled up the tactical specifications for Target Omega. "Lieutenant, the range would be, let me see, over 2 million kilometers. That's not artillery range, that's interplanetary ballistics. The projectile flight time alone would be over 6 hours. 7 hours and 23 minutes, Sarah corrected. Assuming optimal trajectory and accounting for gravitational influences from the system's gas giant." Captain Williams looked incredulous. Even if such a shot were theoretically possible, the Krillians would have plenty of time to track the incoming projectile and intercept it. Their defensive systems would destroy it long before it reached the target. Sarah shook her head. "Not if the projectile follows a carefully calculated trajectory that uses the system's asteroid belt for concealment. I can plot a course that keeps the round hidden behind asteroid cover for most of its flight path, emerging into clear space only for the final 30 seconds before impact." She called up a 3-dimensional projection of the Krillian home system, her finger tracing a complex path through the asteroid field. The shot would require perfect timing and absolute precision. The projectile would have to thread between hundreds of asteroids, use gravitational slingshot effects from 3 different planetary bodies, and arrive at the target during a specific window when their defensive sensors are masked by solar interference. Webb stared at the projected trajectory. "Ma'am, the mathematics for something like that would be... we're talking about calculations that would challenge the most advanced computers in human space." "I can do the calculations," Sarah said simply, as she had said so many times before. But this time Admiral Morrison hesitated. He could see something different in the young artillery officer's demeanor, a cold determination that went beyond military duty. "Lieutenant, this mission would require us to move our artillery platform to a different world, one much closer to the Krillian home system. The risks would be enormous. Sir, intelligence reports indicate that the Krillians are preparing for a final assault on Earth. If we don't strike at their command structure now, we may not get another chance." Morrison studied her carefully. There was something personal driving this request, something beyond strategic considerations. "Lieutenant, have you received news about your family?" Sarah's expression didn't change, but she was quiet for a moment before responding. "My homeworld was destroyed 3 days ago, sir. Everyone I knew there is dead." The command staff exchanged glances. They had all heard about New Manitoba, one of the peaceful farming colonies that had been completely wiped out in the Krillian advance. To lose one's entire world, one's family, everything that connected a person to their past. It was the kind of loss that could drive someone to desperate actions. "Lieutenant," Morrison said gently, "I understand your desire for revenge, but we can't risk the entire task force on. This isn't about revenge." "Sir," Sarah interrupted, her voice still perfectly calm, "this is about ending the war. The Krillians have proven they will continue their advance until every human world is destroyed. The only way to stop them is to remove their ability to coordinate their attacks." She turned back to the tactical display, her finger pointing to specific installations on the fortress world. Target Omega contains their primary communication arrays, their strategic planning centers, and their high command staff. One precisely placed artillery round could cripple their entire military organization. Major Rodriguez looked skeptical. "And if the shot misses?" "We'd have revealed our position for nothing, and the Krillians would know exactly what we were attempting." "I won't miss," Sarah replied with absolute confidence. Admiral Morrison made his decision. "Lieutenant Chen, you've never failed to hit a target when you said you could. If you believe this shot is possible, then we'll give you the chance to take it. But understand, this will be the most difficult artillery shot in human history. If it fails, we'll have lost our best asset for no gain." Sarah nodded. "I understand, sir. But I also understand what's at stake. The Krillians have shown no mercy to civilian populations. If we don't stop them now, every human world will suffer the same fate as New Manitoba." Over the next 12 hours, the human task force began moving toward their new position. Sarah spent the time refining her calculations, running through the complex mathematics required for her impossible shot. The trajectory would take her projectile through an obstacle course of asteroids and planetary gravity wells, requiring split-second timing and perfect precision. But as she worked on the calculations, she couldn't stop thinking about her parents' farm on New Manitoba. She remembered the quiet evenings spent watching the sunset over the grain fields, her mother's patient lessons about patience and determination, her father's belief that action spoke louder than words. They were gone now, along with everything else she had loved about her quiet childhood. But their lessons remained, and they had taught her that sometimes the most important words were spoken not with voices, but with decisive action. Soon she would have the chance to speak for all of humanity, and her voice would carry across the void between stars. The world-designated Kepler 438c was a desolate rock on the edge of the Krillian home system, barely large enough to maintain a thin atmosphere. It had been chosen for their artillery position because of its unique orbital characteristics on positioned at exactly the right distance and angle to provide a clear trajectory to target Omega through the asteroid. Sarah stood on the barren surface, watching her crew assemble the most powerful artillery system ever built by human hands. The Thunderstrike platform had been modified beyond recognition. Its barrel extended to nearly 200 feet in length, its power systems upgraded with fusion generators that could provide the enormous energy needed for interplanetary ballistics. "Lieutenant, the targeting computer is online and ready," reported Corporal Martinez. "All systems show green across the board." Sarah nodded, but she had already decided that the computer systems would be used only for verification. A shot of this complexity required human intuition, the ability to compensate for variables that no computer could predict. She had spent the last 18 hours refining her calculations, taking into account everything from solar wind patterns to the gravitational influence of distant moons. "Sergeant Webb, what's our communication status with the fleet?" she asked. "All channels are clear, ma'am. Admiral Morrison is standing by for your firing solution." Through her enhanced rangefinder, Sarah could see Target Omega in the distance, a massive artificial world bristling with defensive installations. Even from 2 million kilometers away, the fortress looked imposing, its orbital platforms creating a geometric web of destruction around the planet's surface. Intelligence reports indicated that the Krillian High Command was currently in session, planning their final assault on Earth. Every senior military leader in the Krillian hierarchy was gathered in the central command complex. Protected by layers of shields and armor that had never been penetrated by human weapons, they would never expect an artillery attack from this distance. "Ma'am, we're receiving priority communications from Earth Command," Webb reported, his expression grim. "The Krillian fleet has reached the Sol system. They're engaging our outer defenses now." Sarah felt a cold fury building in her chest. While she stood here calculating trajectories, Earth was fighting for its survival. Every minute she delayed could mean the difference between humanity's survival and extinction. "Load the special projectile," she commanded. Her crew worked quickly to position the unique ammunition that had been designed specifically for this mission. The projectile was larger than any artillery round ever fired, packed with enough explosive power to devastate an entire city. More importantly, it was equipped with advanced guidance systems and penetrator charges designed to punch through even the strongest defensive barriers. "Projectile loaded and armed," Martinez reported. "All systems ready for firing." Sarah made her final calculations, running through the mathematics one last time. The projectile would travel for 7 hours and 23 minutes, threading between asteroids using planetary gravity to alter its course, and arriving at target Omega at precisely the moment when solar interference would mask its approach from defensive sensors. But there was something else she had to account for, something that the intelligence reports hadn't mentioned, but that she had deduced from studying the Krillian defensive patterns. Their shield systems operated on a rotating frequency cycle, just like the Devastators had, for approximately 30 seconds every 10 minutes. The shields around the command complex would flicker to a lower power state. If her projectile arrived during that window, it would have enough penetrating power to break through. If it arrived even a few seconds too early or too late, it would be harmlessly deflected. "Admiral Morrison, this is Artillery Alpha," she spoke into her communications headset. "I'm ready to commence firing. Request final confirmation of target priority." Morrison's voice came back immediately. "Artillery Alpha, you are cleared to engage target Omega. All human forces are counting on you, Lieutenant. Make it count." Sarah looked out across the alien landscape one final time, thinking about her parents' farm on New Manitoba, about the quiet lessons they had taught her about patience and determination. Then she focused entirely on the mathematics of the shot, visualizing the trajectory her projectile would follow across 2 million kilometers of space. "Firing solution computed," she announced. "Range 2,047,312 kilometers. Flight time, 7 hours, 23 minutes, 14 seconds. Target, Krillian High Command Complex." She paused, double-checking her calculations one final time. Everything had to be perfect. Fire. The modified Thunderstrike system erupted with a sound like the world splitting apart. The massive projectile shot out of the extended barrel at incredible velocity, disappearing into the star-filled sky with a flash of ionized air. For several seconds, the thunder of the shot echoed across the barren landscape. Then there was silence. "Projectile away," Sarah reported calmly. "Impact in 7 hours, 23 minutes. Now came the hardest part, waiting." For the next 7 hours, Sarah and her crew could do nothing but monitor the projectile's progress and hope that her calculations had been correct. There was no way to adjust the trajectory once the round was fired, no way to correct for unexpected variables. During the long wait, reports continued to arrive from the battle for Earth. The Krillian fleet was massive, composed of hundreds of dreadnoughts and thousands of support vessels. Human forces were falling back toward Earth's atmosphere, fighting desperate delaying actions while civilian populations evacuated to underground shelters. "Lieutenant," Webb said quietly as they monitored the communications, "what if the shot misses? What if the calculations are off by just a small amount?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "Then we'll have failed and humanity will have to find another way to survive." "But the calculations are correct, Sergeant. I've checked them a dozen times." As the hours passed, Sarah found herself thinking about her journey from the quiet farming world of New Manitoba to this desolate rock on the edge of enemy space. She had never wanted to be a soldier, never dreamed of commanding weapons capable of destroying entire worlds. But circumstances had forced her to become something she had never imagined. A voice of thunder that could speak across interplanetary distances. 2 hours to impact, Martinez reported. "Projectile is on course and maintaining optimal trajectory." Sarah nodded, but she was already thinking about what would happen after the shot. If her projectile found its target, the Krillian command structure would be crippled. Their coordinated assault on Earth would collapse into chaos, giving human forces a chance to counterattack. But if the shot missed, or if the Krillians had defenses she hadn't anticipated, then humanity's situation would be even more desperate than before. 1 hour to impact, Webb announced. All tracking stations confirm the projectile is following the predicted path. Sarah stood and walked to the edge of their position, looking out toward the distant fortress world that she could no longer see with the naked eye. Somewhere out there, her projectile was racing through the void, carrying with it the hopes and fury of an entire species. 30 minutes to impact. Projectile has cleared the asteroid belt and is beginning final approach. The tension in the air was almost physical. Everyone on the artillery crew was watching their instruments, monitoring the projectile's progress toward its target. Across human space, military commanders were waiting for news of whether Sarah's impossible shot had succeeded. 10 minutes to impact. Defensive sensors on target Omega are beginning to register the incoming projectile. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. This was the most critical phase of the entire mission. If the Krillian defensive systems could lock onto her projectile and destroy it, 7 hours of flight time would be wasted. 5 minutes to impact. Krillian defensive systems are attempting to track the projectile, but solar interference is limiting their accuracy. Sarah closed her eyes and visualized the final moments of the projectile's flight. It would be coming in at a steep angle, using the planet's gravity well to accelerate to even higher velocity. The timing had to be absolutely perfect, 1 minute to impact. Krillian shields are cycling to high power mode. Sarah held her breath. Everything depended on whether her calculations about the shield cycle were correct. 30 seconds to impact. Shields are beginning to cycle down to maintenance mode. This was it. 7 hours of flight time, years of training, and a lifetime of preparation all came down to the next few seconds. 10 seconds to impact. Projectile is on final approach trajectory. Sarah could almost see it in her mind, her artillery round screaming down through the thin atmosphere of target Omega, racing toward the heavily fortified command complex, where the Krillian High Command was meeting. Impact. The communication channels erupted with voices as observers throughout. The system reported what they were seeing. Sarah's projectile had struck target Omega at precisely the calculated impact point, just as the fortress shields flickered to their vulnerable state. The explosion was visible even from their distant position, a brilliant flash of light that briefly outshone the system's star. Direct hit, Webb shouted. The command complex is completely destroyed. But Sarah was already listening to the tactical reports flowing in from across the battle zone. With their high command eliminated, Krillian forces were falling into disarray. Fleet formations were breaking up as individual commanders tried to retreat to safety. The coordinated assault on Earth was collapsing into chaos. She had done it. With a single impossible artillery shot, she had changed the course of the entire war. Artillery Alpha, this is Admiral Morrison. The voice on the radio was filled with awe and relief. Lieutenant Chen, I don't know how you did it, but you may have just saved humanity itself. Sarah looked out across the alien landscape, feeling a sense of completion that had nothing to do with military victory. She had found her voice at last, and when she spoke, the entire galaxy listened. 6 months after the destruction of Target Omega, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck of the UES Victory, watching the last Krillian fleet surrender to human forces in the Centauri system. The war that had threatened to destroy humanity was finally over, brought to an end by a single artillery shot that had traveled across 2 million kilometers of space to strike at the heart of enemy power. The aftermath of her impossible shot had been everything the strategists had hoped for and more. With their high command eliminated, Krillian forces had fractured into dozens of competing factions, each fighting for control of the remaining fleet elements. Some had attempted to continue the war, but without central coordination, they had been defeated piecemeal by human counterattacks. Others had simply fled back to their home territories, abandoning their conquest of human space. The woman who had once sat quietly in the back of briefing rooms, never raising her hand to speak, was now the most famous soldier in human space. Stories of her incredible artillery skills had spread throughout the colonies, growing with each telling until they reached almost mythical proportions. Children on distant worlds played games where they pretended to be Artillery Sarah, the woman who could hit any target from impossible ranges. But fame had never been what Sarah wanted. As she stood watching the surrender ceremony, she found herself thinking about the quiet farming community on New Manitoba where she had grown up. Her parents would have been proud of what she had accomplished, but they would have been more interested in the person she had become than the legends that surrounded her name. Colonel Chen, the voice belonged to Admiral Morrison, who had been promoted to Fleet Admiral after the victory at Target Omega. The surrender ceremony is about to begin. The Krillian commanders are asking specifically to meet the artillery officer who destroyed their high command. Sarah turned from the observation window, her expression thoughtful. "Do they understand what happened, sir? Do they comprehend how we defeated them?" Morrison smiled. "I think they're beginning to. The Krillians are a hierarchical species. They believe in the power of strong leaders and centralized control. The idea that one human soldier could eliminate their entire command structure with a single shot has shaken their understanding of warfare itself." They walked together toward the main conference room where the formal surrender would take place. Along the way, they passed groups of human soldiers who snapped to attention when they saw Sarah's distinctive artillery insignia. She had become a symbol of human determination, proof that individual skill and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. "There's something else, Colonel," Morrison continued. "Earth Command has approved your request for reassignment. You'll be transferred to the Colonial Development Corps as soon as the surrender ceremony is complete." Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of relief. The KODC was responsible for helping war refugees rebuild their lives, establishing new colonies to replace those destroyed by the Krillians, and providing support for families who had lost everything in the conflict. It was exactly the kind of work she wanted to do, using her skills to build rather than destroy. "Thank you, sir. I'm ready for a different kind of mission." The surrender ceremony itself was brief but historically significant. The remaining Krillian fleet commanders formally acknowledged defeat and agreed to withdraw from all human territory. They would return to their home systems and begin the long process of rebuilding their own civilization without the militaristic hierarchy that had driven them to war. But it was the private meeting afterward that Sarah found most meaningful. Fleet Admiral Morrison had arranged for her to speak privately with the senior Krillian commander, a being called Hive Leader Zakth, who had been one of the few high-ranking officers to survive the destruction of Target Omega. Zakth was tall and insectoid, with multiple arms and compound eyes that seemed to see everything at once. When Sarah entered the room, the alien leader studied her with obvious curiosity. "You are the artillery voice who spoke across the void," Zakth said in carefully pronounced human speech. "Your single voice silenced our entire choir of command." Sarah was struck by the poetic way the alien described her artillery strike. "I did what was necessary to protect my people." "Yes," Zakth replied. "We understand this now. We believed that power came from many voices speaking in unison, from vast fleets and coordinated attacks. You showed us that sometimes the most important voice is the one that speaks alone, with perfect precision." The alien leader paused, seeming to gather its thoughts. "Your species fought differently than we expected. We prepared for battles of mass against mass, fleet against fleet. We did not prepare for individuals who could change the course of war through skill alone." Sarah found herself thinking about all the quiet moments that had led to this. The patient calculations, the endless practice, the determination to perfect her abilities even when no one was watching. "We learned long ago that every person has something unique to contribute. Sometimes the quietest voice has the most important thing to say. A valuable lesson," Zakth acknowledged. "One that we will remember as we rebuild our civilization." After the meeting, Sarah walked through the ship's corridors, thinking about the strange journey that had brought her from a farming world to this moment of victory. She had never wanted to be a soldier, never dreamed of commanding weapons capable of destroying worlds. But when her people had needed her voice, she had found the courage to speak. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood on the surface of New Harmony, a colony world being established to house refugees from the destroyed farming communities. The landscape was similar to New Manitoba, rolling hills covered with grain fields, small settlements connected by quiet roads, the kind of place where hard work and determination mattered more than grand speeches. Her new assignment was to oversee the establishment of defensive positions around the colony, but she had requested that her artillery systems be configured for construction rather than destruction. The same precision that had allowed her to hit targets across interplanetary distances could be used to place building materials with perfect accuracy, to clear land for farming, and to help create new homes for families who had lost everything. As she watched the first families arriving at the new colony, Sarah thought about her parents and the lessons they had taught her. They had shown her that the most important conversations weren't always the ones that happened in meeting rooms or briefings. Sometimes the most meaningful communication happened through actions, through the work you did, the care you showed for others, and the dedication you brought to making the world a better place. She had spent years learning to speak with artillery, to communicate across vast distances with perfect precision, but now she was learning a different kind of communication. The quiet conversation of building communities, of helping people create new lives, of using her skills to nurture rather than destroy. The war was over and humanity had survived. But more importantly, they had learned something valuable about themselves. They had discovered that victory didn't always come from the loudest voice or the biggest weapon. Sometimes it came from the person who spoke rarely but acted decisively, who calculated carefully and struck with absolute precision. Sarah Chen had never raised her hand to speak in casual conversation. But when she chose to use her voice, whether through artillery fire or through the patient work of rebuilding, the entire galaxy had learned to listen. And in the quiet moments between her words, in the spaces where her precision mattered most, she had helped create a future where her people could continue to grow and thrive among the stars. The woman who had once sat silently in the back of briefing rooms had become the voice that spoke for all of humanity, and that voice, when it chose to speak, could move worlds.